Hey everyone, quick note before the video starts. My audio kind of is a little wacky today. Sorry about that. So if you get this loud beep, just kind of ignore it and go on. Thanks, enjoy the video. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name's Katie for those who have for some reason forgotten, and this is Books R Us. So it's a few days into April already, and it is National Poetry Month. So going along with of doing different months. Last month it was Women's Month, um, so forth and so on. This month it's Poetry Month, so I am going to talk about my top 10 favorite poetry books. Now, I don't usually read poetry at all. Usually it was like, oh, it was a class assignment in college or in high school or something along that line. But last year I did read a bunch of kids' poetry because we had a display up, and I'm sure I'm going to read more this year as well that I don't have planned. But I am going to give you my top 10 favorite poetry books, either written in poetry form or about poetry as a whole. So the first one is Love That Dog by Sharon Creech. It's actually written in poetry form, and it's about this kid who's in like fourth or fifth grade, middle school age type, whose English teacher keeps assigning him and his class poetry to write about. So you see the poetry in the books, the poetry he's written for class, as well as poetry he's written about his like everyday life. So it's really interesting, and I think it's a good way for kids to experience poetry, read poetry for the first time by themselves. Good ways to show that it's not always prose type. So I thought that was really cool. The next book I have isn't poetry itself, but it's about poetry, and that is The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. A fairly new book. It just won like 5 different awards a few months back, and it's about a high school girl who has a fairly strict religious mom and dad. I think dad too. Yes, dad too. Who doesn't really like to let the parents don't really like to let her or her siblings like venture out into different things, which include for the main character, for the poet X, poetry. She has to keep all of her poems secret. So that is why this book is on this list. Both of these books that I talked about I did rate them 5 stars. So I really like that book. I read it back in February. The third book on my list is called Over the Hills and Far Away, A Treasury of Nursery Rhymes by Elizabeth Hamill. Again, another 5-star rating. Being a children's librarian, this was really interesting to see all of these different poems and nursery rhymes put together that I remember hearing growing up, but for one reason or another, I forgot. But it was really interesting because it actually gave me some thoughts on what to bring to story times and remind me of some oldies but goodies. The next one is a picture book, the 4th one on the list, and it's called The Crane Girl. Now, as it doesn't deal, like, it's not written in poetry form, it's written in prose, and it's not specifically about poetry. However, there are haikus in each section of this picture book, so every like 2-3 pages there's a haiku. So that's why I included it in this. The Crane Girl by Curtis Manley. It's about a girl who weaves, and this is like a traditional, maybe not traditional, but it's a Japanese story. And it's about a girl who weaves out of feathers, and the person who's receiving this, weaving this blanket at the end, doesn't know how she's getting her feathers until they walk in on her taking out her own feathers, hence the crane girl. Little haikus everywhere. You don't always see that in books. And again, I think it's really good to get poetry introduced to kids in this way fairly early on. The next book I have on this list is Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur. Another 5-star rating from me. It's a collection of poems by Kaur, dealing all about different subjects that Kaur wanted to address about their life, what they've gone through, all of that. But yeah, it was, I believe this was their first work. I know they have another one. I can picture the cover. I'm just not thinking of the title right now. But I know they have another one out that is also really good. I'm not sure what I rated that one. I think I rated that a 4 or 5 as well. Now, the next one that I have on this list is a classic poetry book for kids, and that is Where the Sidewalk Ends by Shel Silverstein. Anyways, you know what it is, hopefully. If you don't, please go read it because it's very classic. I gave it a 5, and it's a lot of poems for kids that are just fairly ridiculous. They're absolutely freaking hilarious. Ridiculous, made up words that you thought wouldn't rhyme, but then he made them rhyme by adding like a little thing at the end. There are short poems, long poems, silly poems, poems in circles, poems like this, like a path somewhere. They're absolutely ridiculous. I love them. I wish that everyone, kids or adults, would read this because they're freaking hilarious and a classic. They're also, I'm looking at Goodreads right now. This book specifically is listed in the book 1001 Children's Books to Read Before You Die, and I absolutely agree with that as well. The next book I have on my list is another children's poetry book, and that is Feeding the Flying Fanalis and Other Poems from a Circus Shelf by Kate Hosford. They're all poems about different people in the circus, in this one specific circus that's made up, and feeding them, and how different people eat different things, and how it's all kind of like a mess everywhere because they're circus people and they're doing these circusy things while eating, and it's really funny and I really like it. Fairly short book because they're all, a page long, and there's only like 20 max of them, but very good, and I really liked it. The next one I have on this list is Mirror, Mirror, a book of reverso poems by Marilyn Singer. Now, I should have an example here, but I don't because this was a library book. And this is basically, you read the poem one way, from top to bottom, and then on the mirrored page, Singer actually reverses it. So then the line at the bottom is on the top, and the line that was on the top is now on the bottom, and they reverse the poem, and then you see how different the poem is, and it's really interesting because Singer takes some classics like fairy tales and does this, and you can see the differences. The next one I have is Poetry for Kids, William Shakespeare. Basically, it's like it says in the title, it's a bunch of different Shakespeare poems or speeches in his plays put into one volume. There are like 30 of them, and I think they're like the ones that were chosen were really good and really interesting to get kids exposed to Shakespeare. I wouldn't say like Shakespeare, but at least exposed to Shakespeare, so then when they do go on to high school, college, wherever after school, they are, familiar with at least a little Shakespeare. I recognized some that I had, like some standalone poems that I read in like 8th grade. I recognized some speeches that I had read in plays in high school and college. So it's a whole variety of things in this one book for kids. Now, on to the last book, I think. Let me check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yes. Now, on to the last book. It's another children's book. Surprise, surprise. Again, I read a lot of children's poetry books last year and probably will read more. And it's called the National Geographic Book of Nature Poetry, more than 200 poems with photographs that float, zoom, and bloom. This was edited, at least, by J. Patrick Lewis. I know there are like poems from different people, but I know it was at least edited by J. Patrick Lewis. So this one was really well set up because like each poem spoke about a different nature aspect, and then the picture that went along with it reflected that. So if like it was like a poem about a river or a brook, there would be a picture of a river or a brook in the background, like as the picture behind the poem, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. Sometimes I say things and then it doesn't make sense. That happens a lot actually, and it's really bad. Anyways, that was really cool because there's like more than 200 of these poems. So sometimes like there'll be like 2 or 3 poems on rivers, and then like 3 on the sky, and then 2 on clouds, and then 5 on grass, or something like that. Something really random and odd. But yeah, I really liked that book. Definitely give it a try if you have the time, which you should, because poems are really easy to read and digest, especially for kids. That was my top 10 favorite books that either had poetry in it or dealt with poetry in the storyline. If you liked this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. Comments are always welcome. What are your favorite poetry books? Leave them below, and I will be sure to check them out, even though I do have a very large TBR list right now. As always, I will see you guys later. Bye.